It started with one sentence that spread across conferences, articles, and social media like wildfire. Filipinos lack innovation. The words came from a respected foreign scientist during an international forum, and at first, many people didn't react. Some laughed it off, some felt insulted, and others quietly agreed, wondering if there was any truth to it. The scientist explained his claim with charts and data, saying the Philippines rarely appeared in global patent rankings, had fewer tech unicorns compared to its neighbors, and was often seen as a country of labor export rather than invention. The room went silent, cameras rolled, the quote went viral, and just like that, the world started repeating the idea that Filipinos were good workers, but not great innovators. But what happened next was something no one expected. At first there was anger. Students shared the clip online with captions full of frustration. Engineers, doctors, programmers, and scientists pushed back, saying the claim completely ignored reality. Filipinos working abroad started telling their stories how they designed systems, built machines, and solved complex problems, but rarely got credit because they worked under foreign companies. Slowly, the question changed from, "Is it true?" to "Why don't we see Filipino innovation?" And that question opened a door that revealed a completely different story. You see, innovation doesn't always look like billion-dollar startups or shiny labs. Sometimes, it looks like survival. In remote Philippine islands with no electricity, locals built water-powered generators from scrap metal. In flood-prone areas, communities invented floating houses using recycled plastic. During disasters, Filipinos created emergency communication systems using old radios and phone batteries. None of these appeared in global rankings, but they saved lives. When the pandemic hit, Filipino scientists quietly developed low-cost test kits, reusable face shields made from office supplies, and mobile apps that tracked outbreaks in areas with weak internet. While richer nations struggled with supply chains, Filipinos improvised, and then the receipts started coming out. People dug into history. They found that Filipino engineer Gregorio Zara invented the two-way video phone decades before Zoom even existed. They rediscovered Fidel Mundo, a Filipino pediatrician who invented a bamboo incubator that saved thousands of babies in rural areas. They talked about Ramon Barba, whose discovery allowed mango trees to bear fruit year-round, transforming global agriculture. These weren't small ideas, they were world-changing. So why weren't they celebrated? Because many Filipino innovations were practical, not flashy. They solved local problems, not global markets. But the story didn't stop there. After the scientist's comment went viral, something shifted. Universities began highlighting Filipino research. Startups started popping up quietly, then loudly. Filipino engineers built AI systems for logistics, health diagnostics, and disaster prediction. Young developers created apps used by millions across Southeast Asia. Filipino scientists joined international space programs, medical breakthroughs, and climate research teams. One Filipino-led team even developed materials inspired by seashells to create stronger, lighter construction panels. Another group designed drones that could deliver medicine to mountain villages. Suddenly, the world noticed something strange. Filipinos weren't lacking innovation, they were lacking visibility. Then came the moment that changed everything. At a global tech summit a year later, the same scientist was invited back this time to review emerging innovations from developing nations. On the stage behind him flashed projects from the Philippines: renewable energy systems for islands, low-cost medical devices, disaster response, AI, and agricultural tech now used across Asia. The audience leaned forward. The data told a different story now. Filipino-led patents had risen. Research output had surged. International companies were opening R&D centers in Manila, Cebu, and Davao. The scientist paused. He looked at the screen, and then he said something no one expected. He admitted he was wrong. He said the problem was never Filipino creativity. It was access, funding, and recognition. He said innovation was alive in the Philippines. It had just been growing quietly, away from the spotlight. That moment went viral too, but this time, for a completely different reason. It wasn't about insult, it was about vindication. Filipinos didn't celebrate with arrogance, they celebrated with pride. Because they knew something the world was just starting to learn. Innovation doesn't only come from billion-dollar labs. It comes from people who adapt, who survive, who solve problems with limited resources. It comes from jeepney mechanics who keep engines running for decades. From nurses who invent new workflows to save patients, from programmers who teach themselves with borrowed laptops and slow internet. It comes from a culture that says bahala na, not as surrender, but as courage to try anyway. Today, Filipino innovation is no longer invisible. It's in satellites, hospitals, farms, apps, and global companies. But the most powerful part of this story isn't the apology or the recognition. It's what happened inside the country. A generation woke up. Students stopped asking, "Can Filipinos innovate?" and started asking, "What problem should we solve next?" And that is why the original statement failed. Because when someone said Filipinos lacked innovation, what happened next was a quiet revolution. That quiet revolution didn't slow down after the apology. It accelerated, spreading into places no ranking system had ever measured. Because once Filipinos realized the world was watching, they also realized they no longer needed permission to create. The next wave of innovation came not from elite institutions alone, but from ordinary people who had always been solving problems in silence. From public school teachers who turned broken tablets into learning hubs. From farmers who combined old indigenous knowledge with modern sensors to predict rainfall. From jeepney drivers who helped engineers design fuel-efficient engines based on decades of street experience. Suddenly, the narrative that Filipinos were just followers collapsed under the weight of real results. Because innovation in the Philippines was never about copying trends, it was about adapting to reality. And that adaptation became its greatest strength. Filipino startups began exporting solutions built for chaos, uncertainty, and limited resources. Exactly the conditions many countries were now facing. Foreign investors started asking a different question. Not can Filipinos innovate, but how did they do so much with so little? This forced analysts to revisit the country's history, and when they did, they found that Filipino innovation had been suppressed, not absent. It was shaped by centuries of colonization, where local ideas were often erased, renamed, or claimed by others. And yet, these ideas survived anyway, passed down informally, embedded in culture rather than textbooks. This is why so many Filipino inventions appeared unofficial, undocumented, but deeply effective, like traditional boat designs that inspired modern naval architecture, herbal medicines now studied in laboratories, and ancient rice terrace engineering that still outperforms modern irrigation systems. As this historical context came into focus, global institutions began to realize they had been measuring innovation with the wrong tools designed for wealthy nations with stable infrastructure, not for countries where creativity meant making something work against all odds. This realization triggered another shift, because when Filipino innovators were finally given funding instead of skepticism, the results were immediate. Laboratories once short on supplies began publishing internationally recognized research. Filipino-led teams started filing patents at record speed, not because the talent was new, but because the opportunity finally was. Perhaps the most dramatic change happened among the youth. They grew up hearing they were good workers but not thinkers, only to watch Filipino names suddenly appear on global innovation lists: hackathon winners, climate tech leaders, biomedical engineers, space researchers. This validation ignited confidence, and confidence unlocked ambition, and ambition multiplied innovation at a pace few expected. Students stopped dreaming only of leaving the country and started dreaming of building something within it, something that mattered, something that solved Filipino problems first and global problems next, because they understood something deeply powerful. If a solution works in the Philippines, it can work anywhere. This philosophy became the backbone of a new innovation identity, one rooted not in imitation but in resilience. It soon caught the attention of international scientists who began collaborating with Filipino teams, not out of charity, but out of necessity. Filipino innovators were uniquely skilled at designing systems that functioned during disasters, power outages, and supply shortages, conditions that were no longer rare in the modern world. As climate change intensified, the Philippines, once seen only as a victim, became a laboratory for survival innovation, producing flood-resistant architecture, low-cost early warning systems, and adaptive agriculture technologies that were adopted by other vulnerable nations. This flipped the script entirely. Now, countries were learning from the Philippines instead of lecturing it, and this shift unsettled many who had grown comfortable underestimating Filipino potential. It exposed an uncomfortable truth. Innovation had never been missing, it had been ignored. The scientist's original statement became a case study in how global bias distorts reality. Because innovation does not always announce itself in English, it does not always come with venture capital backing, and it does not always prioritize profit over survival. Once this bias was acknowledged, the conversation widened further, examining how Filipino overseas workers had been silently innovating within foreign systems for decades, optimizing hospitals, factories, and tech teams without recognition, often labeled hardworking instead of brilliant. When these workers returned home or connected with local ecosystems, they brought global experience that fused with local ingenuity, creating hybrid innovations uniquely Filipino. This convergence created a momentum that could no longer be dismissed. Multinational companies began relocating research hubs to the Philippines, not for cheap labor, but for problem-solving talent. This marked a psychological turning point, because the country was no longer asking to be included. It was being sought out. The scientist who once doubted Filipino innovation became a footnote in a much larger story, a reminder of how icily the world misjudges those who innovate differently. And yet, the most powerful outcome of that insult was internal. Filipinos stopped seeking validation altogether, realizing that innovation does not need permission to exist, only space to grow. And that space was now being created in classrooms, communities, and small labs across the country, where young minds were taught not just to memorize, but to question, to tinker, to fail without shame. and to see constraints not as barriers but as raw materials for creativity. This mindset shift may be the most important innovation of all, because it ensures sustainability beyond trends or headlines. It ensures that even if global attention fades, Filipino innovation will continue quietly, consistently, and unapologetically. And when future scientists look back at the moment someone said Filipinos lacked innovation, they may laugh, not out of arrogance but out of disbelief. Because what happened next was not a rebuttal. It was an awakening, one that proved innovation is not about where you come from, but how deeply you understand the problems around you and how bravely you choose to solve them. And the Philippines, shaped by hardship and hope, has been solving problems all along. Only now, the world is finally paying attention. If this story challenged what you thought you knew, share it. If it sparked pride or curiosity, like it. And if you want to witness what happens next in this ongoing revolution of ideas, subscribe and follow, because the era of underestimating Filipino innovation is not just ending, it is being replaced by something far more powerful.